Denmark was the last large industrial nation to fortify with salt. And they had seen countless examples to where it had unleashed a lot of thyroid disease. So they tracked it. And they have socialized and centralized medicine. So they could do a really good job tracking it. A press of a button, they could see how many prescriptions were written for thyroid meds, how many diagnoses, how many procedures. So they fortified in 2000. They were prepared to watch the effects. And for 16 years that they tracked, they saw an average annual increase of 50% for all types of thyroid disease.
Welcome to the Anthropology Podcast. I'm your host, Megan Walker. As a former naturopathic doctor and anthropologist, I align the intersection of personal performance, purpose, and innovative thinking in badass women working to change the world as entrepreneurs and go-getters. Anthropology is the study and science of what makes an entrepreneur think, feel, and perform in a path compelled by a vision for helping others, solving problems, while building a life on your own terms. Together, we are exploring the health, mindset, and strategies that distinguish the world's best entrepreneurs. This is the Anthropology Podcast. Welcome to episode 206 of the Anthropology Podcast. And here's a little insight I'm going to give you about today's episode. As I was moving through this interview and having this incredible conversation with my friend, Dr. Alan Christianson, I actually had this moment where I was like, I wish I was back in practice. I wish I was back in practice and I could pick up the phone and call all those patients that I had been working with respect to their thyroid health about this overlooked element of thyroid disease. Dr. Alan Christianson is a licensed board-certified naturopathic endocrinologist who has focused almost his entire career on thyroid care. He's a New York Times bestselling author whose recent titles include The Thyroid Reset Diet, which just came out, and The Metabolism Reset Diet. Dr. Christianson's been featured on The Doctors, Dr. Oz, The Today Show, and he's the founding president behind the Endocrine Association of Naturopathic Physicians and the American College of Thyroidology. In short, he is highly credentialed to have this conversation. And what we unpacked in this particular interview was really some overlooked evidence with respect to thyroid health. And true to form, Dr. Christianson is not someone who's just going to look at and speak to evidence. He's going to look at, speak to evidence, apply it to patients, and then deconstruct it in a way that we can all understand. This episode, I'm going to be honest, is for those people who have had to manage thyroid disease, people who know other people in their lives with thyroid disease. And here's the secret I'm going to let you guys in on. This is nearly a third of our population. Thyroid disease has become epidemic. And our interview today sheds some light on why that is exactly the case. It is truly my honor to have Dr. Christianson back on the podcast. And I'm excited for you to get to hear him again today. Dr. Alan Christianson, welcome back to the Anthropology Podcast.
Dr. Megan Walker, thank you so much for having me. Good to be with you today.
Well, I'm delighted to have this conversation. It's been a while since we've had a chance to talk about thyroid. You have a new book coming out. Can you give everyone of us a bit of an update in terms of, one, how you're doing in this unprecedented time? But the second thing I want to know is what has compelled this new book coming out? What new research, what new investigations, what new pieces have really compelled you to bring this to the table? And we're going to have an amazing conversation today about it.
That's awesome. So the first one, quick and easy. I'm breathing. My family's well. I have food on the table. So things could be a lot worse. I'm thankful. I'll leave it at that. People are faring much more difficult with that right now. And I hope for good changes in the very near term. Second one, the quick answer as far as what's new. So 2007 was the 100-year mark of Dr. Hashimoto's work. 1907, he figured out that most thyroid disease was an error of the immune system. And so 2007, a lot of researchers said, hey, what have we got to show for the last century? Would Dr. Hashimoto be proud of us? And their answers were not good. They realized that thyroid disease is rapidly on the rise. People are not doing well who are on treatment. And they said, we've got to figure this out better. So a large amount of new research came from those ideas, and it's not really been pulled together and applied to clinical practice just yet. So that's what inspired the book.
I want to unpack this conversation, and I want to be really mindful in doing that I feel like we could, in a hot second, engage in this, like we could just geek out on the science here, and we could go really deep. But I want to make sure that we bring everyone along that journey with us. And I'm hoping how we can start out is that you can define thyroid disease for us so that we are really clear in having this conversation today, what the catchment is and the scope of our conversation.
Yeah, for sure. So we've got this little thing, actually, we're on video just ourselves, I guess, but there's this little thing that's sitting.
That's awesome. It's a stuffed thyroid. If those who you're like, what are we looking at? Yeah, of course you have a stuffy, you have a thyroid.
So it's something that, if you think about a bow tie in terms of where it would be physically, the approximate size, the approximate shape, there's something like that just below the skin, below the Adam's apple, and it controls how our body burns energy, how we repair our tissues, and how we send nerve signals, those big three things. Now, it's vital. It's controlled by the brain, by the liver, by the cells, by the kidneys. However, it can go wrong. And it goes wrong in three big ways. So the first one is that it can make the wrong amount of hormone. It can make too much or too little. The second way it can go wrong is it can grow incorrectly. It can get lumpy. It can get too big. It can get cancerous. And the third thing is it can freak out your immune system. And your immune system can start to attack it and break it down. So those are the main ways in which thyroid disease happens.
You know, as you're describing this, and I feel like there's so many people going, wow, look, thyroid disease it's pervasive, right? Everyone and their mother's got something going on with their thyroid. Why is that? Is this an inherently, in your opinion, is this an inherently weak organ? Or is it sort of the canary in the coal mine organ? And we've got an environment right now that is rendering it more susceptible, or there's an earlier susceptibility than other areas of the body.
Yeah, great point. So it's something to where since about 1980, the rates of thyroid disease started to pick up. 1990, they really started escalating. And between 1990 and present, many forms have gone up about threefold. There's clear data that's true for thyroid cancer, not just catching more of it, there really is more of it. And also in terms of thyroid treatment, there's 3 times as many people on thyroid treatment now than there were just a few decades ago. And as far as why this is occurring, susceptibility, canary in the coal mine, really curious thing, but in the idea about trying to rethink thyroid disease from this perspective now of this new century we're entering, they've come down to 3 real drivers of thyroid disease, and one of which you alluded to, showing up earlier, you said. So age is one of the biggest drivers. Whatever things go wrong, each year we live, we've rolled the dice one more time. There's one more chance those things that go wrong could happen. So yeah, each year, each decade, it gets more common. So age is one, can't do much about that, Next is gender. There's a lot of reasons that were not conclusive, but a lot of theories why we think women are more prone to autoimmune disease in general and thyroid disease more in specific. Also, something we can't do as much about. But the third driver turns out to be iodine tolerance. So there's not a lot of difference from person to person in terms of iodine requirements. Most of us need similar amounts for thyroid function. However, iodine tolerance turns out to be very different from some people. So some do not tolerate as much or as much fluctuation in iodine as others.
Just for everyone listening, what is iodine?
Yeah, so this is an element, it's a mineral, and it's an essential compound. It's not the bad guy of the story. It's something we need for the thyroid to work. But it's a really weird nutrient. Almost all nutrients are used in many parts of your body for countless chemical reactions. And we certainly can get deficient in any nutrient, but it's kind of hard to get too much. I mean, you can get toxic in any nutrient, but the gap between getting enough and getting toxic is pretty big for pretty much all nutrients. But iodine, none of those things are true. We only know that it's essential in one part of the body. We only know that it's essential for one set of chemical reactions. And the range between minimal requirements and then maximal tolerance for some people is just crazy, crazy close.
So we've always talked about the thyroid and its connection and correlation with iodine. What has changed in our understanding or in your research about that connection and relationship?
Yeah, so what's changed has been the upper limit by which some people have thyroid disease triggered by iodine. We've always known that too little can be a problem, and we've always known that too much can be a problem. People can receive massive doses of iodine when they get a CT. They might be given that for contrast. And just classically, that can trigger something like toxic nodular goiter, one of the less common types of thyroid disease. But the new data now is that globally, they've tracked the rates of thyroid disease, the onset of that, and it turns out that just being a tiny bit above what's considered a healthy amount for many people can trigger them to get thyroid disease. And the other new perspective, which inspired me really to write the book, is that it's one thing to know why things go wrong, and it can be helpful to avoid problems if nothing else, but can you do anything about it, once the horse is out of the barn? And the exciting version is you can do something about it. We've got clinical trials now showing that if you can go back to a good range or even below a range to give the thyroid a chance to get rid of the excess, thyroid disease can reverse for a good percent of people.
Is iodine in our salt a problem?
Yeah, so there's big sources that we get of iodine, and salt is one of those top 3.
Where else are we looking for this? Because now everyone's like, oh my gosh, I thought I was supposed to have iodine. I thought I was supposed to put it on my food. I mean, where have we landed on this? And I feel like what you've really said here is we've always known there's a connection to iodine. What we haven't really been able to place is this individualization of this idea of upper tolerances and how each body is requiring and interfacing with iodine, and we're starting to understand that with greater specificity. And I love that because I feel like this is just one of the tenets of naturopathic medicine, that of course there's going to be some element of individualization in how we are going to uptake and interact with particular nutrients. But I feel at the same time what that's really doing, I'm going back big picture here, is we have certain things within our lifestyle and our food supply, iodized salt being one of them, where we're classically applying this one size fits all treatment to how we are approaching disease and health. Is this? I mean, should we just stop iodizing our food in general and start fresh?
Well, that's been a big discussion point, and the question is about, what is a certain iodine intake in a population? But then the more meaningful question is, what are the rates of thyroid disease? So, for example, in the United States, we started fortifying with iodine in 1924. There was never a federal mandate, but it was done by a state-by-state basis. Michigan started that, and it was a success for the intended goals. So, to a little depth if it's of interest, but World War I, a whole lot of possibly eligible soldiers could not ship out because they had goiters. And that got people's attention. Like, hey, we need soldiers. We got to do something about this. So they realized that this was really common in areas to where soils were iodine deficient. We talk a lot now about the benefits of local food, and it's all valid. However, back when local food was your only option, if your soils were deficient in something, you were deficient in something. So now we really can't easily get deficient in the modern diet. All foods have some, and it's not that we need none. We always will get some, but the excess is the issue. So when we started fortifying back in 1924, the rates of goiter among school children in the relevant areas went from 35% down to about 2 or 3% in a decade. And that was awesome. That was totally a win. However, the rates of autoimmune thyroid disease, so Mayo Clinic in Olmsted County, Minnesota, they were tracking this stuff before and after. And before then to after then, the rate of autoimmune thyroid disease in women, 30s, 40s, and 50s changed. It changed by 26-fold. So not in the right direction. It went up 26-fold, not percent, 26 times higher after fortification. Denmark was the last large industrial nation to fortify with salt. And they had seen countless examples to where it had unleashed a lot of thyroid disease. So they tracked it. And they have socialized and centralized medicine. So they could do a really good job tracking it. A press of a button, they could see how many prescriptions were written for thyroid meds, how many diagnoses, how many procedures. So they fortified in 2000. They were prepared to watch the effects. And for 16 years that they tracked, they saw an average annual increase of 50% for all types of thyroid disease. And they did it flawlessly. They wanted to achieve an average increased intake of about 50 micrograms per day. They nailed it. They did a phenomenally effective job of it. But their thyroid disease, their goiter rate in children went down. That was the main benefit. Right. But their rate of adult thyroid disease went up year after year.
And we're getting really granular on one facet. And I had always considered thyroid disease to be a multifaceted condition. Is iodine relevant in all cases? Is it a certain percentage? Like, how does this particular issue and this part of the puzzle fit into this multifactorial disease model we had always viewed the thyroid as participating in?
For sure. So in terms of different types of thyroid disease and different drivers, so the most common forms of thyroid disease are the autoimmune variants. So the body attacks the gland, it slows down. That's pretty much all thyroid disease. Next up is the body attacks the gland and it speeds up. And then we have the structural issues of growth and enlargement. Then we've got the thyroid cancers. There are some rarer types like subacute thyroiditis, de Quervain's thyroiditis that have nothing to do with iodine. But hyper, growth changes, thyroid cancer risks, they're all linked pretty highly with iodine status. And in terms of other drivers of thyroid disease, one big paper that did a consensus on the question, what do we know now that causes thyroid disease? They said there's 3 things that are irrefutable, 3 things only. There are many things that may have some small contribution, but either their contribution is questionable, its effect size is quite small, or the relevance as far as changing that thing is there's really no leveraging points. The horse is already out of the barn. But the 3 things that are large drivers, that are irrefutable, that are relevant now, and also there are some historical factors, like back when people got their tonsils irradiated, those things get on the list, but they're not relevant. That doesn't happen anymore. Right. The things that happen now that are relevant are age and gender and iodine, and the thing that we can do something about takes away age and gender. So as far as things that can really change the onset, and that's not to say that there's nothing else that can help treat thyroid disease or treat thyroid symptoms, but as far as causative factors that one can address, that's the one that fits through all the filters.
And if we're talking about Hashimoto's, or we're talking about hypothyroidism as being correlated with this iodine excess, are we in the corollary looking at something like Graves' disease or hyperthyroid as being a deficiency of iodine?
No. The funny thing is that almost any kind of thyroid disease can be caused by too much or too little.
Right.
And today, the risks for too much in the modern world are much, much higher than too little. Autoimmune thyroid disease, oddly enough, almost never happens with iodine deficiency. There are enlargement issues that can happen. So goiters can occur especially, or we can see cretinism or congenital hypothyroidism, but almost no autoimmune thyroid disease. So in the States, for example, when we had some iodine deficiency and we had more prevalent goiters, we had no autoimmune thyroid disease.
Interesting.
But yeah.
And what about when the two are occurring simultaneously?
Meaning which two?
Goiters and, let's say in this case, hyperthyroid or Graves.
Yeah. So we can see structural disease from iodine excess as well. So too much can drive both. And as far as being a clear driver, it's a contributor definitely to the risk for Graves. The correlation is almost complete for Hashimoto's. That's the strongest correlation. And we think too about this global status. There's still a thought that we have this deficiency problem. And if we go back just a little bit, like 92, we did. Back then 112 nations were categorized as severely deficient, and there was none that were ranked as excess. And that's, I was saying, it's kind of the early age of thyroid disease picking up. And if we go from 92 to 2014, the number of nations that were deficient dropped to 0. And that was a big win for public health. That solved a lot of huge problems. But the number of nations that were at risk for thyroid disease to iodine excess went from 0 to 52. And the U.S. is in that list.
So how do we determine our iodine status?
Yeah, there's honestly not great tools. And the other question is, does it predict one's response to lowering iodine? So if someone's saying, hey, I've got thyroid disease, would it help me to lower my iodine? And you would think that a simple test would say, I've got too much or not, and therefore if I've got too much, it would help. If I don't have too much, it wouldn't help. So there's been several large clinical trials in which people with thyroid disease were put on diets to eliminate excess iodine. And a lot of them got better. We can talk about that. However, their iodine status going into the study did not predict who and who would not respond. So it wasn't helpful that way. However, in those who did not respond, their iodine status did predict whether or not they were compliant, whether they found all the hidden sources of iodine.
Interesting.
And they really did things right and just didn't work for them, or if they just didn't do things all the way.
Do they just happen to be really good at storing iodine? Like, is that how this is working genetically? We're just like, these people are just super good at storing it in places they shouldn't?
Well, the difference was more so in those cases that they just didn't identify all the incoming sources of it. And there's a lot of hidden sources that people miss. And we can talk about that too.
Yeah, let's talk. I know my listeners are like, Megan, can you please start asking the right questions? And I know a lot of NDs who are doing, they're doing thyroid testing and they're checking status based on, the speed at which you're able to absorb iodine on the skin. Is that I'm watching your face and you guys can't see Dr. Christianson's face, but I can. So can we talk about iodine absorption just while we're on that span of testing, and then let's talk about food sources.
For sure. So iodine testing, it's very plausible. I was taught about that idea too. The idea is you paint some betadine on your skin, and the rationale is if you need it, you suck it in. If you don't need it, you don't. Well, first off, there are definitely mechanisms like that in our gut for nutrients, including iodine. We do that to some extent for iodine in our gut. And we do that for iron. We do that for some others as well. But there's no known mechanisms on the skin that intentionally absorb nutrients. And that's not to say we can't absorb nutrients, but we don't choose. We don't pick and choose based upon our status, because that's not our normal route of intake. So a big study was done in which that question was asked. And they had 3 types of skin. One type of skin was those that had normal thyroid function, normal iodine status. One group was iodine deficient. One group was dead. It was cadaver skin. And they looked at the response of iodine painting and iodine absorption on all 3 types. The differences were completely random, whether you're got a good thyroid or not, too much iodine or not, whether you're alive or dead, it's all random. So iodine on your skin, to be really precise, those compounds have a mixture of iodide and iodine. Iodide is invisible. Iodine is that dark amber color. When iodine hits your skin, it interacts with oxygen. And over the course of a few hours or more, it oxidizes into iodide. Most of it goes away because it oxidizes, not because you absorb it. Some of it you do absorb. We can absorb between 4.5% to 20% of iodine across intact skin, but it's not based upon how much we need. And that can be one of the sources of iodine excess, is the amount that we can get in our cosmetics.
Okay. So now that everyone's like, please don't ask about testing again, Megan, please get us to the sources of iodine. Let's actually start with that. Let's start with cosmetics and these non-traditional sources, and then let's move to food, because I think what you're about to deliver for people is a series of inconvenient truths, but let's do it regardless.
Well, so getting this data and seeing people respond to it, and then checking people and seeing those that didn't respond and seeing their iodine levels still high, I just racked my brains and tore my hair out and what's going on. And I found data showing that the FDA a few years back, they pulled iodine out of hand sanitizers. There was many hospitals to where their workers were developing high rates of thyroid disease, and they were all at very unsafe levels of iodine because they were using these iodine-based hand sanitizers. They were absorbing it. So then I started thinking through, we do absorb it across our skin. I started thinking through the stuff that we put on our bodies. And PVP is a really popular ingredient in cosmetics. It makes creams smooth. It makes creams not separate. It makes them not get nasty. It does useful stuff, but it contains a fair amount of iodine. And then also a lot of natural compounds will use kelp or seaweed extracts for the same reasons. And I did the math and I thought about it. And there's some things like, mascara uses those compounds, but how many grams of mascara do we actually ingest into our bodies?
I'm going to say not much.
Probably not a lot, right?
Right.
But then think about like a body lotion or think about a conditioner. Yeah. And we can easily use 20, 30 grams of those things. Yeah. And I started running all the math. I said, okay, yeah, but, so we use that much, but that PVP, that's probably only 3% of the formula. So let's chop that down. And I said, well, PVP is only like, 20% iodine. So we'll chop it down there. And we only absorb like maybe 4.5% of that. So we'll chop it down there. But it's all micrograms. Starting dose of 20 grams is 20 million micrograms. So even after all that chopping, you can come out of the shower with 10 days more than a safe limit of iodine just from what you put on your hair. And
I'm just picturing, you're in Arizona, yes? And I'm in Canada, and I'm just picturing all these Canadians who've been slopping themselves in cream to make it through the winter. I'm like, do we see an increased incidence in thyroid disease every spring with our Canadians? Okay, so we talked a little bit about this in the context of cosmetics. What about food? What are some of these other unknown sources of iodine that we are accessing without our knowledge?
Yeah, so the top 3 in food, you mentioned one, which is salt. Not a lot of mysteries there, but one thing that's unexpected is probably the highest source of common salts is pink Himalayan salt. It has about twice the iodine as iodized salt.
Interesting.
And that one surprised me. Yeah. I love kosher salts. I love Malden brand sea salt. I like Celtic brand gray sea salt. Those are ones that are marginal, almost no amounts of measurable iodine. But yeah, kosher salts are awesome. So past those 2, the next big sources are dairy and processed bread products. And in those things, the amounts, they're probably the biggest ones that have changed over these last several decades. There's been many large studies showing that the amount in them, actually 23 of the top 25 dietary sources of iodine, 23 of them have doubled or tripled since the mid-90s, and especially processed bread products and dairy products. And it's not grains and it's not gluten. It's just the things that are made that you get from the store.
I was going to say, is gluten the consumption of gluten an independent risk factor for thyroid disease and autoimmune? Or do you actually think we're seeing this confusion with respect to glutinous food then being fortified in iodine, and we're seeing this impact?
I think that's exactly it. I've had a lot of friends that I trust and a lot of patients say, hey, I did better when I cut out gluten. And then I look at all the research on the relevance of gluten to autoimmune thyroid disease. It's been studied. It's honestly not panned out. However, when I look at dietary assays of a typical gluten-free diet versus a typical diet, yeah, you'll plummet your iodine intake by going off of processed grain products.
Right. Okay, so we've got grains, we've got salt, dairy.
Yep.
And then kelp. Are we throwing kelp into a category here?
For sure. So processed grains and dairy, they're the ones that changed the most the last few decades. Again, the Himalayan salt's kind of a new thing that's people have gotten into, but the other sources have been stable for some time, but they are significant. So sea vegetables are just massive, massive sources of iodine. They're there. The average person, they're not as big a part of the diet, but for those that do consume them, they contribute a lot.
Are we vilifying iodine across the board?
We're not vilifying it by any means, and we won't get none. All foods have some. There's no foods that have zero. So what I'm talking about are the big outliers. These are the things that push you way outside of a safe zone very easily.
And when you're talking about the Thyroid Reset Diet and where you're going with this new research and how we apply it to someone's everyday life, is the crux of that, let's reduce our iodine-containing foods. And then what? What else are we doing in conjunction with that to start to really repair the thyroid? And then I guess my secondary question is, because I just can't stop myself right now, what sort of timeline are we expecting in terms of reducing the input of iodine to starting to see symptomatic changes in terms of our thyroid health?
Let me grab that one first. That's a quick one. And that one's three initial change, rarely more than a month, full stabilization, 9 months on the outside, most typically 3 to 6 months. We've had several clinical trials in which people are randomized to go on the Thyroid Reset Diet or to just not be on a specific diet. And with no other treatments, in one study, they took those that had Hashimoto's for an average of 4.2 years. Their blood scores showed that they were about 4 times above the normal range. For those to whom this means something, their TSH average was 14.1. Many had TSH scores of 50 to 200. They were severely hypothyroid. In 3 months of doing nothing but the diet, 78.3% of them had normal thyroid function, with an average TSH score down to 3. Now, of those who did not, there was three categories. There was those that they did not achieve a low enough iodine level. They were checked. They were still excreting a lot of iodine. So they really weren't on track yet, or they hadn't given it long enough. Or there were those to where their starting TSH was in that 50 to 200 range. And they plummeted, but they weren't yet normal. And then the last group is those that did it right. They were on target, but they didn't budge. And that last group was about 3% of people or less.
Wow.
Yeah.
This is a big deal.
It's a big deal. That was one of several studies, and the results have been pretty much identical, whether it's autoimmune hypothyroidism, non-autoimmune, subclinical hypothyroidism. It's been the same sort of findings.
Okay, we're going to come back to the food piece in a second, but I just had a follow-up question on that, and that is, do we see any budging or change in terms of antibody levels if we're measuring those simultaneously?
Yeah, very much so. And here's a quick story on why this happens and why that happens. So, and this also responds to your prior question about the relevance and how it fixes it and what else needs to be done. So in the thyroid, you're taking iodine and you're making active thyroid hormone. So thyroglobulin is a long protein that when it's healthy and it's all filled up, it's got seats on the bus for 11 to 13 atoms of iodine. So if there's too much iodine in your system, however, you end up with like 60 atoms on that bus that has 13 seats. So they're stacked all over. And iodine, think of it like bleach. You know, it's a very powerful source of free radicals. That's why it kills infections on your skin. But when there's too much of it there, those free radicals, they damage your thyroid cells, they slow the thyroid hormone output, and they alert your immune system to come in and attack your thyroid. So because your thyroid can only get rid of a speck of iodine in the hormones, when there's extra, it's stuck there. So if you have to get to a low level so you can clear out that excess. But once you do, the exciting thing is that we now know that the thyroid cells can heal, but they can't heal when there's extra iodine in there, sending out all these free radicals and pulling in the immune cells.
Is this something we've all just collectively been missing?
Completely. This is brand new. I was missing this stuff 4 years ago. This is all new data. This is brand new stuff.
And what are we expecting for those individuals who are currently medicated to manage their thyroid disease?
Yeah, great question. So 3 big considerations. First off of which is that if their output does improve, they need their medications adjusted. Their medications can be not appropriate for them and also cause harm and delay their thyroid recovery because their body is not giving room for their gland to heal. That's one. The other 2 thoughts are this works in 2 different ways. One of which is it can help your thyroid heal, but the other one is that it also changes how your body responds to thyroid hormones. Now, because your thyroid sucks in iodine to make the hormone, one thing that happens when you get a lot of iodine is you slow your thyroid activity, but you also make your cells resistant to thyroid hormones. Your body does not want to have too little thyroid hormone, but it's scared to death of too much. You know, too much can shut down your heart in a matter of hours. So we've got all these things to protect us against extra. So we slow our thyroid, but we also just like close all the gates and keep the thyroid hormones from getting in. And so we've seen a lot of people to where they have no thyroid. They'll probably never have any improvement on that because there's no gland there, but they're on thyroid meds and they're still symptomatic. Yet when they lower their iodine, now they start responding better. They'll still need the thyroid meds, but now at least they're responding to it because their body is not fighting the hormones any longer.
Absolutely fascinating the way that these pieces are impacting us. Just in terms of people going off and applying this, and I know if this was me and I was sitting and I was on thyroid medication, I'm listening to this, 1, I would be grabbing your book that's coming out in just a few weeks. 2, I'd be having a conversation with my primary care provider around this, whether that's a naturopathic doctor or a physician. What are some of the key tenets of that conversation that are going to assist in an individual's success in terms of bringing their physician on board with this? Because I find with anything in medicine, it takes us as a group a long time to adopt these new paradigms. And unless someone's been versed in this conversation, I suspect that they're not necessarily going to have a simple conversation. How would you advise people engage in that conversation?
Simple thing. Part of that is the whole chapter on working with your team. So I haven't read your book yet, and look at that. Yep. I've got some conversation scripts there. The basic idea is, hey, keep an eye on me because my needs might change. In a month, I might need a different amount of medication than I need now. So that's the bulk of it. And my experience has been that doctors are really on board. They're eager to have people do better, and they're eager to take steps needed to assist with that.
I think that is a fair and optimistic approach with respect to the conversation. And regardless, that is exactly how I would want most people's physicians to approach this conversation. If someone comes to them and says, listen, there's new emerging research, you can absolutely have access to it. I'm open to working in partnership with you to see if we can start to see some shifts and changes. That actually should be the MO of your care team. And if it isn't, then there's other red flags. So I agree with you. I suspect that that's not always people's experience. But I love the advice and the perspective that you're giving them. What are we missing here from this conversation? You've literally written the book on this. You've been working with patients forever related to thyroid health, and most recently related to some of these concepts. Are there ideas in this conversation that you're like, there's this one piece that I just really want to make sure that everyone hears? We need to impart this to have a fulsome discussion.
It's a really simple thing, and there's a couple of points I'll mention, but the big key concepts are straightforward. Your thyroid, it's not that thyroid disease is something that you're stuck with. It's really something that has to be perpetuated. And so when you take away what's driving it, it can often reverse. And so the book, it's a really simple thing. There's basically a reset phase and a maintenance phase, and I've put foods into green light, yellow light, and red light. If you're someone who's developed thyroid disease, you want to avoid the red light foods, and none of us are perfect forever, but they're not your friend. So just know that. The green light foods are always fine. And the reset phase, that's where you're actively trying to get your thyroid to work better and get your body to respond better to those hormones. So during the reset phase, you just do the green light foods and call it good. Now, once you've really hit that level to where your thyroid's gotten better, you're responding better to the hormones, you're happy, things are stable, move on to maintenance. And at maintenance phase, you can do 1 or 2 of the yellow light foods per day with no real consequence. You've got some leeway back again. So it's really that simple.
I love this. When is the book hitting bookshelves, and where can people find it?
January 19th, wherever books are sold. And it's coming out real quick.
That is fantastic. Well, this podcast is coming out just after that date. I'm really excited for people to get their hands on it. And before I let you go, we have to engage in a compulsory element of the Anthropology podcast. And these are our rapid fire questions. And we've got a few new ones for 2021. So I'm going to get you to indulge me, but I am just going to call out that one of the questions we asked before was, what is something totally badass about you that nobody would otherwise know? And you still have the most memorable answer. You started to say you like mountain biking, and I was like, oh, that's fantastic. And then you said, on my unicycle, and it was this total mic drop moment. So I set the bar so high for people with that question in the past. I've scrapped it for 2021. But my first question for you is this: what's the most impactful book you have ever read?
Wow. Boy, ever long term. This is
like, what book when you're like, oh, that book, it was just like right place, right time. It just shifted.
There's been so many, but the most ever would have to be Cosmos by Carl Sagan. And I was in 6th grade, and
classic,
a lot of people were into, sports heroes or whatnot. And he was my sports hero of sorts. So completely changed my life. And I still dedicate a lot of my work to his memory. And
yeah, I had a total Carl Sagan thing when I was younger too. Yeah, that's really awesome because no one's ever mentioned that before. What is your?
If you've not seen the Pale Blue Dot, I would highly recommend anyone to take 5 minutes and see the Pale Blue Dot vignette of his.
Okay, I'm gonna make sure that I check it out. What's your absolute favorite health hack?
Absolute favorite health hack. Simplest thing for me is just having a daily block time for exercise. I see this in myself and many, to where if we try to do things 5 days a week, 6 days a week, the day off becomes every day. So I just every day, I always have an hour set aside first thing. And it's not the same each day. I mean, there certainly are some days where I do it lighter and I might just do some stretching or foam roller or whatnot. But always having that block there, I never think about it. So the night, one of my bedtime rituals, I put up my exercise clothes and I know what I'm going to do tomorrow morning. And it's just automatic.
Yeah, I love that. Morning routines start the night before too, which is so key. How would you identify or articulate your purpose?
Yeah, my purpose is to take information and make it actionable. To distill through facts. Like this book is a great example. This is data that's all there. And it's stuff these are answers that can help people, but no one really packaged or put this together or made it simple or accessible before. So that's my purpose, is to take information and complexity and apply it in ways that can help people have better health outcomes.
And you're so good at it. Last question for you. Entrepreneurism, are we born this way or do we learn to become entrepreneurs?
I would have to imagine that there's some facet of both. I've had some of my entrepreneur mentors argue that in most populations, entrepreneurs make up 5-10%, and they're rarely much higher than that. So there's got to be some level of each. Myself, I wouldn't have thought that I was born as such, but not having a lot of other options coming into my career in natural medicine, I did step into that world, and I'm glad to have done so. So I think there's got to be some facets of both to that.
Dr. Alan Christianson, always one of my favorite guests on the podcast. Where can we send people to learn more about your work and what you're up to in the world?
Yeah, easiest place is drchristianson.com, drchristianson.com, and just Google my name and you'll find that.
Amazing. Thanks so much for being with me today.
And thanks for having me, Megan. Always happy to be with you.
Thank you for joining me for today's episode. One of the things I love about the conversations that I get to have on the Anthropology podcast is that there's such a density of information. The learning that I get to have, the learning that I get to bring to you, I know has been life-changing for so many people. Over the next few weeks, we're going to be running an opportunity for you to take your life-changing information and package it in such a way that more people can have access to it. We'll be running a 5-day course building challenge, and I would love for you to be part of it. If you have the knowledge to be able to move people forward, if you have an idea or a program that you want to have more people participate in, the course building challenge is for you. For practitioners who are used to working with patients one-on-one, I want you to think really hard about those things that you are talking about over and over again. I want you to think about what you wish people knew before they walked into your office the first time. We're going to help you put together a course in just 5 days that you can release to your audience, make your practice simpler, and reduce the amount of time that you are using repeating the same things over and over again. You can head over to my Instagram bio, Dr. Megan Walker, hit the link and join us for the challenge. It's 5 days. It's entirely free. And we're going to finally move the needle ahead on your practice and your capacity for impact. See you there.